Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself wondering how the very rules that, well, govern our global economy actually came into being, and maybe more importantly, how dramatically they've been forced to adapt, or often, fail to adapt to a world that's just been utterly transformed by technology? I mean, from the rubble of post-war reconstruction right up to the dizzying rise of artificial intelligence, the foundations of our economic order are in constant, sometimes pretty violent flux. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the fascinating history and, frankly, the urgent future of global trade and finance. We'll explore how past attempts at international cooperation, even the well-intentioned ones, inform the incredibly complex challenges we face today with everything from data flows and AI to shifting global power dynamics. We're drawing on some truly insightful material for this deep dive, a recent paper and a really compelling interview with a leading trade economist.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here and what we really want to get across to you isn't just the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of how these systems work. It's also about understanding the sometimes surprising underlying circumstances that shaped them in the first place. And this raises a really important question. What can we actually learn from history to navigate the, well, unprecedented economic and geopolitical shifts happening right now without just trying to copy paste solutions from a completely different era?
Absolutely. So our mission today is to try and cut through all that complexity and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. We want to help you grasp the big picture of global economics, maybe with some genuinely surprising facts and moments along the way. Think of it as maybe a shortcut to being well informed on one of the most critical topics of our time. Right, let's rewind the clock. Let's start at the beginning of the modern era, so to speak. Picture 1944. World War II is finally winding down, and leaders from 44, maybe it was 43, countries gather in this quiet resort town, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. What was their grand vision? What were they actually trying to build there?
Well, their core idea was incredibly ambitious, really. They wanted to rebuild devastated economies, obviously, but crucially, to prevent future global conflicts. And they planned to do this by setting up a new system of international cooperation in trade and finance. This conference ultimately gave birth to two institutions you'll definitely know: the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF's major original job was supposed to be smoothing out economic imbalances between countries, mainly by managing exchange rates. And there was also a significant plan for global trade rules, although, well, that didn't quite pan out as intended. Oh, and it's an important historical note. Germany and Japan weren't there. They were still enemies at the time.
Okay, so a truly noble goal, aiming for peace and prosperity. But as often happens, the vision and the reality, they diverged pretty quickly, didn't they? What actually emerged from Bretton Woods versus what was originally planned on paper?
You're absolutely right. What actually materialized was quite different. For instance, the International Trade Organization, the ITO, which was meant to be the big global trade body, it never actually got approved by the US Congress. So instead, we ended up with the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. You should think of GATT as a much smaller, almost club-like preferential trade agreement. Initially, it was arguably designed more to exclude the Soviet bloc than to create truly global rules. And the IMF itself, it was scaled down quite a bit from John Maynard Keynes' grander vision of a kind of global central bank. Instead, the US dollar, backed by gold, became the de facto main vehicle currency, and even the World Bank's initial job, rebuilding Europe, that was quickly taken over by the US Marshall Plan. So the World Bank had to pivot, find a new purpose, really, as a development support organization for, well, the developing world.
Wow, okay. So right off the bat, it sounds like the Bretton Woods architecture didn't really achieve its primary objective of a unified, peaceful, global framework. We almost immediately plunged into the Cold War. It seems like a system built for one kind of world had to function in a very different, divided one. But despite those, initial deviations from the grand plan, the Bretton Woods era itself, which ran roughly until 1971, is often looked back on as a period of remarkable success and stability. What was it about that time? What made it work so well or seem so beneficial, even if it wasn't exactly what the architects had envisioned?
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The benefits we saw during that period were largely products of very unique economic and political circumstances that, honestly, are just not replicable today. For starters, imagine a world where capital accounts were largely closed.
What does that mean exactly for listeners?
It means money couldn't just flow freely across borders for investment or speculation like it does today. It was like having financial dams in place, which, maybe surprisingly, helped keep currencies stable because you didn't have sudden capital flight destabilizing things. Trade was also much simpler then. It was mostly in manufactured goods and agricultural products, almost no trade in services or intellectual property to speak of. And production systems were largely nationally integrated, made in America, really meant all made in America, not these fragmented global value chains we have now. And what's really striking, I think, is that even though the system lurched from crisis to crisis internally, it never actually exploded globally. Not like the 2008 financial crisis. Instead, you had this remarkable 3 decades of incredible price stability. Think about this. The price of oil in terms of gold was flat. Commodity prices were incredibly stable. This stability gave markets, companies, farmers, workers a real sense of the true value of things. And that fostered a period of pretty good global development without major financial or banking crises rippling worldwide.
That's a really powerful point. Stability coming from unexpected sources, perhaps unique conditions rather than perfect design. But even within that relatively stable period, there must have been immense internal pressures building up. It couldn't have been perfectly smooth sailing.
Oh, absolutely. There was continuous building pressure on the US dollar. There was even a significant run on US gold reserves during the 1960 election campaign. This led to the creation of something called the gold pool, where several central banks tried to collectively prop up the dollar's value against gold, but even that faced a massive run in 1968. There's this amazing story, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, about so much gold being bought up and stored by the Bank of England that a floor actually cracked under the weight.
Wow.
Yeah. Eventually, the Americans just had to, well, throw in the towel with the Nixon measures in 1971. Nixon took the dollar off gold entirely, and that decision effectively ended the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system and kicked off a completely different set of global economic conditions, a whole new era.
Okay, so the Bretton Woods system, in its original fixed-rate gold-backed form, collapses in 71. What kind of world did we then sort of segue into? What were the fundamental forces driving that huge shift?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the world shifted dramatically, and it was really due to a confluence of technological advancements. We truly moved from those national production systems we talked about to what you could call a made-in-the-world system, characterized by these incredibly complex global value chains, heavy trade and intermediate goods, parts, components. There were three really major technological developments driving this. First, containerization. Pioneered back in 1956, it literally standardized shipping containers.
Those big metal boxes you see everywhere.
Exactly. And that standardization just slashed transport costs and made global logistics unbelievably efficient. A total game changer. Second, the introduction of the Boeing 747 wide-body jet in 1970. Suddenly, you could move high-value goods quickly by air, effectively shrinking the world for commerce. And third, and perhaps the most profound, was information technology. Things like RFID tags, barcodes, and then, crucially, the release of the IBM personal computer in 1981. All this tech made managing these highly distributed, complex global supply chains far, far easier. It's actually no coincidence that the term supply chain management was coined in 1982, right after the PC arrived.
So these weren't just, isolated inventions appearing randomly. It sounds like they fundamentally rewired how production worked on a global scale. This wasn't just about moving good faster, it was about completely restructuring manufacturing itself.
Precisely. A great example is after the Plaza Accord in 1985, which revalued currencies. Japanese firms started moving production offshore, particularly to Southeast Asia. This move triggered what we now call the Asian miracle, that period of rapid economic growth in places like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. But it also required developing entirely new management techniques, like just-in-time delivery, to handle these complex, dispersed manufacturing structures. So this globally integrated production system, this made-in-the-world idea, was already pretty well established, maybe 25 years old, by the time the WTO agreement was signed in 1995. And that agreement was really designed, in many ways, to govern this new, deeply interconnected reality.
Okay, but the evolution of technology certainly didn't stop with PCs and supply chains. We then moved into an entirely new kind of economy, one where intellectual property, intangible assets became hugely valuable. How did that happen? What were the main triggers for that shift?
Right, the value of intellectual property, IP, started to really climb massively in the 1980s, again, driven by that same tech revolution. The IBM PC was a factor, yes, but also breakthroughs like CAD/CAM software, computer-aided design and manufacturing. That just accelerated innovation and design processes enormously. And crucially, in the U.S., the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 basically incentivized universities to commercialize their research, their IP. It was about monetizing academic discovery. This huge shift towards valuing IP led the WTO, when it was formed, to introduce the TRIPS agreement, that's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Its purpose was to deal with IP protection in international trade. But here's where it gets tricky.
How so?
Unlike trading goods, which is often seen as win-win, IP protection often functions more like a transfer payment. Money flows from the user of the IP to the owner. Getting TRIPS agreed was essentially a one-shot deal in global trade negotiations. It was very contentious. And that difficulty in agreeing on IP rules arguably contributed to the breakdown of later negotiation rounds, like the Doha round. And it also helps explain the rise of these big, maybe regional trade agreements as countries struggled to find common ground on these complex new issues globally.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. With IP becoming so central, it feels like the stage was set for an entirely new kind of economic power. What was the next technological leap that really launched us into this data-driven economy we're living in now? And how did that give rise to the tech giants we all know?
Yeah, it was really a confluence of breakthroughs around, say, 2010 that properly kicked off the data-driven economy. Think about it. You had Geoffrey Hinton and his team at the University of Toronto developing the foundational neural networks for deep learning back in 2006, 2007. Then, seemingly unrelated at the time, the Apple iPhone launched in 2007, but that device really started the age of mobile computing, generating this enormous, unprecedented flow of data into the cloud.
Data which AI needs to learn, right?
Exactly. AI is incredibly data hungry. And then, the final piece, maybe, in 2009, Stanley Chen at Stanford figured out how to apply GPU's graphics processing units, originally for video games, to drive these neural nets much faster. That innovation is basically why NVIDIA became the superstar firm it is today. It went from a market cap similar to, I don't know, a New Zealand dairy firm to a multi-trillion-dollar company. It was transformative. As Eric Schmidt, who was Google's CEO then, famously put it in 2010, the world has changed, we see everything. And this just fueled the meteoric rise of these superstar firms, your Googles, your Facebooks. They amassed these colossal user bases. Facebook, for instance, hit 2.5 billion users. That's more people than the combined population of the EU, China, and the US. This incredible concentration of data and power, in turn, fed directly into geopolitical shifts. Most notably, the explosion of the US-China rivalry after Huawei took a lead in 5G networks around 2018. That was seen in the US as a kind of Sputnik moment, a real wake-up call that they might be falling behind technologically.
Okay, so we've traced this path.
Yeah.
National economies, then global value chains, then this data-driven world dominated by a few tech giants. Now, we seem to be firmly in the era of artificial intelligence, or what you've called machine knowledge capital. What does this next, very current shift really entail for us?
AI is genuinely a new general-purpose technology, like electricity or the steam engine. It's going to change almost everything. If you think of it as machine knowledge capital, it's productive capital. It will inevitably capture a significant share of national income. And yes, that means displacing some workers while profoundly complementing the skills of others. Consider this. Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, he now predicts artificial general intelligence AGI might be here as early as the 2030s. We're talking about a really fundamental restructuring of how value is created.
Right, and how does this new reality, this machine knowledge capital, fundamentally impact global governance, the way nations interact? Does it lead to more cooperation or less?
Well, global governance has had to adapt, or try to adapt, with each big technological shift. The data-driven economy of the 2010s was hugely concentrated, dominated by a few platforms. AI, however, might be different in how it's monetized. While the big platforms train these massive large language models, actually making money from them seems to require providing access to hundreds of thousands of firms to develop specific applications. For example, Baidu in China claims they already have over 200,000 firms and 5 million AI developers building applications on their platform. This suggests perhaps a potentially more distributed economic structure than we saw in the 2010s, where the focus for countries will be intensely on generating their own rising star firms and unicorns in the AI space. National competition.
Okay, so potentially more distributed, but still highly competitive.
Exactly, because this new technology also generates what economists call supernormal profits, huge profits, far beyond what you'd expect in a normal competitive market. And these massive potential profits are allocated essentially by market power, and they induce incredibly intense rivalry between nations, not cooperation. Just look at the industrial policies we're seeing right now. The EU's €800 billion recovery plan, the US CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, China's AI 2030 strategy. energy. These are enormous unilateral national efforts that, frankly, pretty much disregard existing WTO rules. The WTO, as I've often said, it's really become like a small claims court for relatively minor trade disputes. It's just not equipped to adjudicate who wins the global AI race when literally trillions in future wealth are perceived to be at stake.
That makes sense. If the stakes are that high, countries will compete fiercely, maybe it's outside the old rules. But this raises a critical question. What are the real dangers if countries don't cooperate on AI rules, if everyone just goes it alone?
Well, the dangers are already here, unfortunately. First, AI has already been weaponized. We are seeing autonomous drones making kill decisions on the battlefield, far beyond Isaac Asimov's comforting three laws of robotics from the 1940s. Second, AI operates in cyberspace, which fundamentally has no borders. Think about the implications of cross-border disinformation campaigns or election interference amplified by AI. There are even chilling real-world examples emerging. The AER incident, for instance, where seemingly harmless pagers were allegedly compromised and turned into remote bomb triggers, or reports of a Tesla Cybertruck being remotely disabled in a conflict zone.
That's terrifying.
It highlights that cybersecurity is going to be the absolute #1 issue going forward. It's the digital equivalent of location, location, location. It's also why the U.S., for example, has significantly walked back its previous stance promoting the free flow of data across borders. Data is now increasingly viewed as a strategic asset, even a potential weapon.
So it really sounds like our policy brains, as you put it so powerfully before, are still trying to navigate using maps drawn for a completely different ocean. Much of what we thought we knew about global economics, power, even security, might be fundamentally wrong now. We need to unlearn.
Precisely. We are like the captain of the Titanic, maybe, using maps from the Lusitania. The icebergs are real and they are new, and our old maps don't show them. We need new charts.
Okay, let's try and connect this back to international finance then. The current global system is still very much centered on the US dollar. What are the main criticisms of this dollar-centric system, and how do emerging powers, particularly China, fit into this conversation about the future of global finance?
Right. The dollar clearly enjoys what Charles de Gaulle famously called an exorbitant privilege. The U.S. can borrow internationally in its own currency without worrying about exchange rate risk, which generally gives it lower borrowing costs. It's a big advantage. However, there's a growing counterargument, particularly from those leaning towards a kind of new populist economics. They argue this is also an exorbitant burden.
A burden. How so?
They argue it forces the U.S. to borrow and consume excessively to supply the world with dollars, which they then link to things like deindustrialization and related social problems within the U.S. This populist view often paints surplus countries like China or Germany as predator economies, causing these imbalances by exporting too much and not consuming enough domestically. And their proposed solutions, often championed by figures like, say, Robert Lighthizer, usually involve things like high tariffs to restrict imports, or maybe taxes on foreign investments flowing into the U.S., trying to force a rebalancing.
And did these kinds of policies, like the tariffs aimed specifically at fixing trade imbalances, actually work when they were tried recently? Because that's a common perception, that tariffs fix trade deficits.
No, generally speaking, they haven't. The Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese goods, for example, did not significantly resolve the underlying trade imbalance between the U.S. and China. There's a well-established economic concept called learner symmetry. It basically states that a tax on imports is economically equivalent to a tax on exports.
So it cuts both ways.
Exactly. Tariffs tend to symmetrically lower both imports and exports, leaving the overall trade balance, the difference between the two, largely unchanged. Fundamentally, trade imbalances are caused by differences in domestic saving and investment behavior between countries, not just by trade policies like tariffs. That's a really crucial, though maybe counterintuitive point for people to grasp. Now, as for China and the dollar's dominance, while the U.S. certainly controls key financial infrastructure like the SWIFT payment messaging system, giving it the power to weaponize finance through sanctions, the dollar remains overwhelmingly efficient. Why? Because of its incredibly deep, liquid, and active exchange rate markets all around the globe, 247. While there's definite talk and some action on increasing bilateral trade settled in Chinese renminbi, RMB, China simply hasn't issued the massive amount of international debt, the liquid RMB assets, that would be needed for its currency to genuinely displace the dollar on a global scale. And frankly, there's also the issue of trust. The Chinese central bank, the PBOC, doesn't yet command the same level of global trust and transparency as the U.S. Federal Reserve. So looking ahead, we simply can't just go back to Bretton Woods. That was a hegemonic system born out of very specific post-war circumstances with clear U.S. dominance. Our current multipolar world with multiple major powers actually looks much more like the situation leading up to the failed 1933 London Monetary and Economic Conference. And that conference famously failed because the major countries lacked a shared understanding of the problem they were trying to solve. They couldn't agree on the diagnosis, let alone the cure.
Right, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, as they say. So, if a return to the past isn't viable, what is a realistic path forward for a new international financial system in today's multipolar world? What's the kind of conversation we should be having, even if it's difficult?
Well, I believe a potentially viable approach for today's multipolar reality actually comes from the work of the late Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Mundell. Way back in 2000, he proposed a hard peg, essentially a fixed exchange rate between the euro, the yen, and the dollar. The idea was to create a truly large, stable monetary mass and relieve some of the pressure on the dollar system. Applying that logic today, perhaps a hard peg between the Chinese renminbi and the US dollar could be a way forward.
Pegging the dollar and the RMB, that sounds politically explosive.
Oh, incredibly challenging politically for both central banks, absolutely. But think about the potential benefits. It could allow both currencies to share both the exorbitant privilege and the exorbitant burden we're talked about, stabilizing the whole system. It would give China the ability to borrow internationally more easily in its own currency, and it might encourage China to consume more domestically, which would help rebalance global trade flows, benefiting both nations in the long run. It's a radical idea, perhaps, but this is the kind of brave, difficult structural conversation we genuinely need to start having if we want a more stable global financial future.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly one last time to the societal impact of all these massive economic and technological shifts. Bretton Woods institutions and the broader set of ideas, sometimes labeled neoliberalism, have often been criticized quite heavily for contributing to rising income inequality in many countries. How valid do you think that criticism is? And how do we even begin to address inequality going forward, especially with AI now in the mix?
That criticism, while very common, often misses the primary driver, I think. The significant rise in the profit share of GDP and the widening gap between worker productivity and wages that we've seen since around 1980 in many Western countries, that wasn't primarily caused by the Bretton Woods institutions themselves or even a specific political ideology, though those played roles. It was overwhelmingly driven by technology. The IBM personal computer making knowledge work scalable, CAD/CAM software accelerating industrial design, the whole industrialization of R&D. These developments meant that income was increasingly captured by intellectual property patents, copyrights, brands, which by its very nature tends to be owned by a relatively small percentage of the population, the owners of capital and ideas.
So technology concentrated wealth in new ways.
In many ways, yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights how many of our governance systems are profoundly outdated. Take patent laws. They're still largely based on rules conceived in the 1200s or 1300s. Originally designed for individual artisans protecting a craft secret, not for indefinitely lived corporations managing vast portfolios of incremental innovations. AI is now dramatically accelerating product life cycles. Does a 20-year patent term even make practical sense anymore in a world where technologies might be obsolete in 5 years or even 2? Similarly, copyright laws, introduced when the written word was rare and costly to reproduce, are now being applied to ubiquitous digital content that costs almost nothing to copy. We desperately need to focus on adjusting the governance of IP itself so it doesn't create these enormous, almost feudal concentrations of wealth for a tiny few, while breeding widespread resentment and populist revolt among the many who feel left behind. Pharmaceuticals are maybe the starkest example. You have situations with monopolies on critical life-saving drugs like certain types of insulin, allowing companies to charge prices that many see as exorbitant and morally intolerable. The system isn't working equitably.
So the message isn't necessarily throw everything out, but more like radically update existing frameworks, laws, regulations, economic assumptions to fit this completely new technological reality we're in. What about the future of work itself? And maybe society? How do we prepare for what seems like another huge transition?
Well, think back. The transition from the agricultural age to the manufacturing age was initially horrific for many people. It led to immense social upheaval, dislocation, poverty, and new urban slums. But eventually, new social compacts and new political structures emerged to manage that industrial society. Things like the rise of parliamentary power relative to monarchs, or the gradual implementation of social safety nets like Britain's early poor laws, unemployment insurance, public education. Today, we are arguably facing a similarly profound societal shift. We're moving rapidly towards lights-out factories, automated warehouses run almost entirely by robots, the 1950s model of a stable, decently paid, lifelong factory job providing identity and community that's simply not coming back for the majority of people. We need to accept that.
So if the old models of work and social structure are fading, what replaces them?
That's the trillion-dollar question. Our current democratic systems, largely designed around a political contest between organized labor and organized capital, feel increasingly ill-equipped for a world where maybe a tiny 1% of tech billionaires control vast digital fiefdoms. We urgently need to forge a new social compact for the digital, AI-driven age. We might need to rethink our very identities. Maybe we move away from defining ourselves solely by our jobs and think more about fulfilling roles in society. The idea being that everyone needs a meaningful role to maintain social cohesion, purpose, engagement. Think of it like a company of players in a theater troupe, like in the movie Shakespeare in Love, where everyone, from the lead actor to the person working backstage, has a vital part to play in the collective enterprise. And yes, this likely means the level of government intervention, the role of the state, will probably continue to rise. The state also rises, as some have put it. Why? To manage the increasing complexity of technologically advanced societies and, crucially, to ensure some form of necessary income redistribution and social support in a world where traditional jobs may become scarcer or less secure.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground. So what does this all mean for us, the listener, trying to make sense of this incredibly complex and rapidly changing world? What's the main takeaway?
Yeah, we really have covered a lot, but if there's one really important fundamental message to leave you with, it's this. The technology arrow is still just rising steadily, relentlessly, and it changes everything. When technology enables entirely new ways of producing things, new ways of interacting, new ways of organizing economic activity, then society must eventually reorganize around it. It always has. We simply have to understand this deep, intrinsic connection between technological change and societal change if we want to anticipate and manage the frictions and problems that inevitably arise. Governments, institutions, individuals, we can't just bail out and hope things stay the same. We have to bail in, actively adapting to this new reality, however challenging that might be.
That's a really powerful call to action. Learn from the past, absolutely, but maybe even more importantly, have the courage to unlearn what no longer serves us, no matter how comfortable or familiar those old assumptions and models might feel.
Exactly. We have to be willing to fundamentally rethink and revisit where we're going, where technology is taking us. The foundational ideas underpinning many of our current economic and political systems were developed for an entirely different world. Relying purely on nostalgia or old models will simply lead us into more, and perhaps even bigger, titanic incidents. We need to navigate by the stars we can see now.
Thank you so much for walking us through that. We really hope this exploration has given you, our listener, a clearer lens through which to view these monumental shifts happening all around us. Maybe it sparked some new insights for you. So what stands out to you from today's deep dive? Maybe take a moment to consider how your own daily life is already being shaped by these powerful technological forces, and perhaps even think about what kind of role you might envision for yourself in this rapidly evolving global landscape.